Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the first in a series of events from our project, Cultures of Digital Hate. So we are Dr. Hannah Yelin and I'm Laura Clancy. And thank you to the Sociological Review for really generously funding 3 events this year as part of the Sociological Review seminar series. And they've also enabled us to set up a website for the project, which is now live. Hannah's just put that in the comment box for you to have a look at. And you can see future events on there, our published research and collaborators, resources we've gathered from elsewhere, and we'll be hosting videos of these events and also guidelines and resources that we develop as part of the project. So just to flag, this event is being recorded and the aim will be that that will go onto the website.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Hannah Yelin. And this project, Cultures of Digital Hate, began when research of ours got picked up by the Sunday Times with a very misleading and inflammatory headline. And this was remediated around the world and exposed us to a great deal of digital hate in response. And rather than just retreat, we treated the abuse that was directed at us as data. And you can read the article that came from that work on our website that's in the chat box. In another meta twist, today's event, which is looking at how to tackle digital hate, caught the attention of some accounts on Twitter this morning and caused a little bit of hostile backlash against one of our speakers. So we had to close our ticket sales early as we didn't want today's discussion to get derailed or become another combative digital space. So apologies if any of your friends or colleagues wanted to come and couldn't. The irony is that it's all just more supporting data for our arguments and more indications of the attendant risks of the harm that we experience sharing our work online. So we've set up Cultures of Digital Hate, which educates, engages and consults on the pervasive social problem of digital hate. And we began the project with a focus on academics, as we are encouraged by our employers to have visible public profiles so that we can disseminate research. And we want to look at how people in that situation might find themselves subject to online abuse, harassment, misrepresentation. And we're currently doing a survey of academics' experiences of this. So if you're an academic and would like to fill it in, the link is in the chat now. So now our goal is to illuminate the ways that the risks of visibility are unequally distributed and how digital hate functions to keep certain voices out of public debate. And we're working in collaboration with those working in digital industries and policy, and researchers working in industry, government and academia. And today we are very lucky, we are honoured, and thank you very much to all of you. We have 3 amazing experts today from law, policy and tech, all of whom are working in their field to actively deal with digital hate. So Laura will introduce our fantastic speakers today.
Yeah, I'm going to introduce all of the panelists and then we'll go through them one by one. So the first speaker will be Chara Bakalis, who is Principal Lecturer in Law at Oxford Brookes University. And Chara's research interests lie in the area of criminal law, and she's particularly interested in the intersections between crime and technology. She has particular expertise in hate crime and hate speech, and her current focus is on the regulation of online hate and on the liability of social media companies. And her work has been cited in various parliamentary reports. The second speaker will be Imran Ahmed, who is the founding CEO of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. The Centre for Countering Digital Hate is an international not-for-profit NGO that seeks to disrupt the architecture of online hate and misinformation. And they've been working with social media platforms, news media and policymakers to enforce change and produce some really amazing reports, which you can find on their website. And the final speaker will be Christopher Bouzy, so founder of Bot Sentinel, a data analysis firm which investigates online bots and hate accounts. Bot Sentinel uses machine learning and artificial intelligence to classify Twitter accounts and add the accounts to a publicly available database that anybody can browse. And the organisation believes Twitter users should be able to engage in healthy online discourse without these kind of inauthentic accounts manipulating the conversation.
So just a few matters on the rules of engagement today. As I've said, the event's being recorded. Please use the comment box for any questions. You can type them in throughout, and we'll save time for going through questions at the end. Any disrespectful comments will not be engaged with. We'd also be really grateful if you would fill in our feedback form. It's extremely helpful to us to be able to demonstrate. Our goal has been to bring together people from a wide range of fields, and it's really helpful to us to be able to demonstrate that we're doing that. So the link to our feedback form will be in the chat box. And also we've got another event next month looking at gender intersectionality and digital hate. And the link to sign up to that will also be in the chat box. And lastly, for our speakers and also for anyone making comments or questions, please don't mention any specific hate accounts by name, as this can then make us the target of further hate from them. And also, if you see us being bad-mouthed on Twitter, don't come to our defense. We have our Twitter settings so that we don't actually see this stuff until I see a friend tweeting, Hannah Yelin is not an ugly bitch, or worse. And that's the point at which I learn that I'm the recipient of online hate speech. So now over to our speakers, who will each take 10 minutes to answer the question of what they would like to see done to tackle the pervasive social problem of digital hate, and what one thing they think would make the biggest difference, the biggest impact. I'll start first of all with Chara Bakalis.
Hello, thank you so much, Hannah. Okay, I'll stop my stopwatch, make sure I don't overrun. Okay, so as Laura has said, I'm a academic lawyer, so my interest is in the law specifically and thinking about what the law can do to try to tackle this problem. So I'll outline to you what the current situation is, where I think the problems are and where we can make things better. But I do want to preface everything by saying that I don't think law is the only thing that can help here. Law, we definitely need to make changes, and we definitely need to improve the law, but there are plenty of ways outside of the law and ways which everyone can get involved in to try to improve the situation. So the law is definitely a starting point, but it's not the only way. So if we think specifically about the law and what the law can do, very generally speaking, there are two ways in which the law could approach this problem. So it could target either individuals who perpetrate hate or individual account holders who perpetrate hate, or it can try to target platforms that disseminate or distribute or allow the hate to appear online. And the law currently targets individuals, doesn't do very much in terms of platforms, but it's about to. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's the online safety bill currently going through Parliament, which aims to do exactly that, to try to hold social media companies to account. I'm going to look at both of these and just think about what the current situation is and what needs to be improved. So if we think about targeting individuals, the main form that this would take is through the criminal law. It's not the only way, but it probably is the fairest way, because if we try to use anything outside of the criminal law, it requires people with money to be able to take cases to court, whereas the criminal law is for everybody. So the criminal law does currently have some offences that could be used to deal with online hate. However, they're not specifically designed to do so, and so they are fairly inadequate. They're not designed to deal with the online world as such, and so there are, they don't work perfectly in the online world. Or it could be that even if they are designed in the online world, they don't really deal with hate as such. They deal with more sort of generic content that we may not like, such as things that are offensive or grossly offensive. So they're not really dealing necessarily specifically with hate. So the existing criminal offences can do some work to help with online hate, but not a huge amount. the biggest thing to really note about the criminal law, and there are some pending changes to the criminal law. The biggest thing to note, however, about the criminal law is the fact that however good a criminal offence is designed to be, the reality is that the sheer amount of online hate that exists online, we're talking about, you know, thousands, millions, billions of pieces of content. It is impossible for the criminal law realistically to deal with this. It's only really going to be able to deal with a very small proportion of online hate, and probably the kind of hate that we might see as being the worst type of hate. So there are, the Law Commission, for example, has proposed new offences based on psychological distress. I personally don't think this is the right approach. I think the new offences are actually probably, I don't think, really going to work. I think they're going to give less protection than the current law. They're going to be quite hard to prosecute, I think. And in any case, they're not really designed to deal with hate as such. They're really designed to deal with psychological distress. And I don't think psychological distress is the kind of harm that we're trying to deal with here. But maybe we can come on to that a bit later on. So those, the changes that are going through Parliament at the moment in relation to the criminal law are not really headed in the direction that I would ideally like. I would prefer much more targeted offences at online hate that are possibly a little bit wider than offences we have for the offline world, but are specifically designed for the online world. But that is not the direction we're headed in. The biggest, as well as the problem in relation to actually policing online hate using the criminal law, the other thing to note here in terms of the criminal law is that the minute we start to criminalise individuals for things they have said, we run into problems relating to freedom of speech. And that's a really, really big issue for us lawyers. In a liberal democracy, it's really important that people have freedom of expression. But freedom of expression doesn't mean that you get to say anything you like wherever you like. And freedom of expression is very much about you not being criminalised. You're not going to prison for things that you have said. It doesn't mean you get to say whatever you like, wherever you like, and that you can have a platform of millions. So that's really where we come on to thinking about how we might target platforms instead to try to make them take responsibility for the hate that they disseminate. So rather than focusing on individual perpetrators only, actually we're focusing on the social media platforms. And that makes sense for all sorts of reasons, as I'm sure Christopher's going to talk to us about in a bit about how AI can be used. The social media platforms, they're really the source of the problem. They're the ones who can actually do something about it. Even if you send a criminal to prison, their tweets and their messages are still online. So it doesn't really solve very much. So social media platforms also have the money. They have far more money than our criminal justice system has to deal with this. And it also makes sense from the point of view of freedom of speech as well. Because as I said before, if we're simply saying to somebody, I'm sorry, you don't get to have a platform with millions, but nothing's going to happen to you because of what you said, then freedom of speech concerns are diluted and not quite as strong. So in terms of platform liability, what can we do? Well, again, with platform liability, we could go down the voluntary route. And so far, that's the route we've been going down. The EU has still does have a scheme of voluntary liability where you make social media companies take responsibility, but there's no sanction if they don't. Now, those voluntary schemes have worked fairly well, but they're not brilliant. And certainly Germany was the first country really to say, right, voluntary schemes are not enough. We are now going to force social media companies to take responsibility, and we will fine them if they don't remove hateful material quickly enough. Early signs suggest that it's working fairly well. It's not, so there were some fears that they'd be overcautious and they'd be removing lots of material and that would have implications for freedom of speech. That doesn't really seem to be the case. But it should be pointed out that the German law only requires reactive measures by social media companies. It requires them to remove material that has been brought to their notice. So they know they've been told that there's something there that's illegal, and then they remove it. So that doesn't force them to be proactive. That doesn't force the social media companies to actually actively try to look for this material and to stop it spreading before someone even, before it's been retweeted several times already. So that's really where the online safety bill that we currently have going through Parliament, which aims to go even further than the German law. It aims to impose a duty of care on social media companies to take responsibility, not just for hate, actually. We are talking about hate speech today, but actually the online safety bill is for a far, far greater range of harms than just hate speech. But it will also be requiring, and we don't know to what extent yet, but it will be requiring social media platforms to actively try to seek out this material themselves, rather than simply react when it's been, when the complaints have come through to them. And they will be fined if they don't behave in the way they ought to. I'm getting to the end of my time, so I think I'll probably stop. I'll very quickly say that I do think this is the right direction that we're headed in. There are obviously lots of issues and problems that we need to, there's going to be, the devil's in the detail here. We do need to be careful that social media companies are respecting our freedom of speech at the same time as protecting victims of online hate speech. And we will have to guard very jealously that sort of dividing line between what's appropriate and inappropriate. But nevertheless, I think, maybe I'm a bit being too positive here. We're not going to get rid of online hate. There's no way we'll get rid of it completely. But this is a step in the right direction. I'm hoping that this is the beginning of things improving to a certain extent. I'm sure this will come back to haunt me in 10 years' time. We'll come back and say it didn't work. But anyway, that for what it's worth, that's my take on the subject at the moment. So I think I'll stop now.
Thank you, Chara, for really interesting points and great timekeeping too. We'll go now to Imran. Would you like to go next?
Hi, my name is Imran Ahmed. I'm Chief Executive of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. I found that both really interesting on the detail, and I'm also reminded that the criminal law is a very blunt instrument when it comes to hate, and the particular sort of presentation of hate that we see digitally these days. In part, the Centre for Countering Digital Hate was set up to look at ways in which we could reduce the prevalence of hate speech, but also the normalization of hateful attitudes in the absence of legislation. We were set up 6 years ago, and I remember in my initial deck that I sent out to funders, it said it'll take 5 years for governments to get off their bums, and it did. And we're only now seeing some action. And actually, ironically, one of the difficulties for CCDH has been that we've shifted a lot more into legislative lobbying and advocacy work in the last year. What is the one thing we could change? Well, I think the one thing we could change is that we could actually decide that digital hate is unacceptable. It's a problem to solve, and decide that we will do something about it. Because I think that we are still locked in discussions and debates over its particular phenomenology, and a lot of debates on what limits our ability to act, rather than what tools we might have available to us to act. And I think it takes an expansive view of, so that there is often, to me, a very desiccated set of solutions. They're either intensely legal and ergo limited by the limited reach of the state in a liberal democracy, or it's technological, and technology is not necessarily the only solution to a technological problem, because the problem we have isn't just technological, it's moral as well. It is the decisions by several there's no such thing as a racist algorithm, for example. There's an algorithm that's programmed by racists. There's no such thing as a misogynist platform. It's a platform designed and managed and administered by misogynists. And if we look at the architecture of digital hatred online, I mean, one of the things that, so we were set up 6 years ago in the wake of things happening in British politics that scared me. Anti-Semitism's, digital anti-Semitism's rise in the Labour Party, which I was then working for. The anti-Muslim and anti-Black hatred and conspiracism that infected the EU referendum and the murder of my colleague Joe Cox MP. And we'd missed that the primary locus of information sharing, of the formation of social mores, norms of attitudes and behavior, and even the negotiation of values, the negotiation, in fact, of the corpus of information that we accept as being facts, had shifted to online spaces of which we had very little understanding of the dynamics and the core rules as well. I mean, at that point, it was controversial, and you'd get into a debate about whether or not it was engagement that drove visibility. I remember having those when we launched Don't Feed the Trolls, when people disagreed with our analysis. And, we now know from Haugen's revelations that was pretty dead on. So let me briefly outline to you, and I'll be hopefully shorter than 10 minutes, the architecture of digital hate as I see it. There are three types of major components in the proselytization and normalization of digital hate. First of all, there are static content points. Those are often websites. They can be posts which become reference points for seeding either direct hatred or the precursors of hatred, the misinformation that underpins hatred. And misinformation underpins a lot of hate, to be very clear. And those are used in two ways. One, they're used as evidence points for further proselytization into spaces like Facebook, which bulk people together into groups and then allow you to mass communicate at zero marginal cost to tens of thousands of people, potentially very, very fast. And so you can seed those evidence points. Hey, look at this article which says, because we found that people don't like to say, I think women are blah or brown people are less clever. They say, look at this article which argues that. The second thing is that they're also used as stimulus for discourse, and discourse primarily happens on platforms like Twitter, where you can affect elite discourse by increasing the prevalence of increasing the visibility of a conversation by saying something controversial, getting a debate going, and of course on an engagement-based platform in which visibility is directly correlated to the amount of engagement. The more bonkers something you say, the more likely it is that you will benefit from algorithmic amplification. And that central shift in what is important in our society has reshaped the norms and our understanding of what people believe. It has an impact on journalists, on politicians. The number of times I'd have a politician come up to me and say, loads of people are saying, and I'd say, well, how many? And it'd be 5 notifications from trolls with 30 followers, and they'd have wasted an hour of time on it. But of course, that shapes the way, it shapes the norms. If you want to use terms like the Overton window, what they think people are talking about. And of course, that's a reflexive process. So each of those spaces affects each other, and eventually they can create resonance and create echoes of each other to create the sense that things are much more frequently talked about than they are. And of course, we have frequency bias as human beings. So the more frequently we see something, the more normal we think it is, and the more likely we think it is to be true. And so the mathematics that underpin those platforms and the way in which they shift our society to believing that hateful speech, which is more controversial, which does attract more attention. I was so heartened to hear Hannah say, don't jump in if you see us being abused, because A, you're rebroadcasting that abuse, which of course is the central insight behind Don't Feed the Trolls. But also when allies jump in to sort of defend you, it makes you, it's basically it's repeating the offense again and again. So it's rebroadcasting it to lots more people, including, ironically, if you do have effective blocks, the person themselves. I mean, the point I would make on that first question of do we decide it's something we want to deal with? It's very simple. I think that the actions of hate actors is designed to limit the freedom of expression of non-white, male, straight, cis men. And that's the net effect of it, is that anyone but knows that the barrier to entry to the platforms that are increasingly vital to the way in which we create our personal brands, express ourselves, maintain relationships, even transact commerce, are subject to abuse if you're a woman, if you're black, if you're brown, whatever else. And so a safe space for hate actors is by definition a hostile environment for anyone else. And once you've accepted that to be true, and you've accepted that to be counter to the very forces of liberalism that allow this particular panel to cohere into one, these voices which would have been silenced for in decades, centuries past, then we can say, well, actually, as part of our values as societies, we wish to push back against that. And there's a different array of tools that we have on that. We have legislation and regulation, sure. But we also have platform actions. We can influence the way that platforms work. And one of the things that CCDH has found and made so clear is that we have the right, in fact, it is part of our fundamental freedom of speech, to tell Twitter, Facebook, Meta, Google, etc., this is unacceptable. Your behavior in tolerating this and enabling it is unacceptable. And to show the economic relationships that underpin their decision making to allow the proliferation of this kind of content. It will require platforms to take action on bad actors. And we've stimulated some of that. I mean, we're quite well known for having, that term deplatform, which I don't like. It just means stop doing business with hate actors. Stop benefiting from the advertising and everything else. Essentially, their jobs are accrue lots of content, monetize it, and then say it's got nothing to do with me, mate. Well, we're saying it has got something to do with you, mate, because you're making tons of money out of it. And that economic relationships have been incredibly powerful in helping us to force platforms to change their enforcement patterns, because of course their policies are usually okay, it's just their enforcement that's really bad, to creating consequences for malignant activity, which of course is renormalizing. It socializes social media. It's almost like a funder pitch. That was pretty good, I thought. I'll use that again. And then user behavior. We're trying to teach users that, Don't Feed the Trolls was a very good example of that. It was really controversial when it came out. I remember getting loads of sort of stick about it. I think it was my first ever day of doing media. I'd never publicly spoke before. We launched it in September 2019, and my first interview was Vanessa Phelps, and she absolutely ripped me apart and said, basically, you're saying we have to say nothing when we're being abused. And it was just I had a mathematical certainty that engaging with hate actors actually amplifies their hatred, and often it's tactically what they're seeking to do. We found that neo-Nazi playbooks in which they talked about the terms you should use that most stimulate people to respond, because they know that response is amplification and amplification is recruitment. And so that direct relationship. So, understanding that and understanding the interaction between algorithms, user behavior, and the actions of hate actors is really important. So mix of things: platforms, bad actor targeting and exposure, legislation, regulation, and user behavioral change, making us smarter about it. We don't need to, with every new technology, it takes some time for us to adjust to work out how to make sure that we don't cause harm using it. And I think we're in that adjustment period. And it's a whole society response that's needed. That's it for me.
Thank you, Imran. That's great. Okay, lastly, over to Christopher.
Hi, my name is Christopher Bouzy, and I am the founder and CEO of Bot Sentinel. And this is a great panel and great discussion. And, I agree with what a lot has been said. But, when we look at laws and legislation and stuff like that, one of the things that when we come across at Bot Sentinel, we talked about German law versus here in the United States, for example. And here in the United States, there's pretty much nothing really right at this point that is governing how social media platforms behave and how they take down stuff. So when you have, for example, something happening in Germany, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's clear cut. But what happens when you have an account that's located in the United States and they're targeting someone in Germany? And let's say here in the United States, we do now have legislation that governs, what happens on social media platforms. Which laws, the platform is supposed to use? Are they going to use German law versus laws in the United States? And then when we talk about hate speech and things of that nature, the next thing becomes, okay, well, what exactly are we removing? Because what's considered hate speech to me may not be considered hate speech to someone else. And that's what platforms are having an issue with even now and trying to govern themselves. It's like, what are we removing? What's the red line where we can't cross that? Once you do this, it gets removed and that's it. And platforms are struggling. We know for a fact that Twitter is struggling with that because certain things that are said, their moderators just don't understand. Certain code words and certain code language and things like that. Moderators, they have a few seconds to look at tweets and move on to something else. So I do believe that it needs to be a mixture between tech and also, legislation, laws to do this. Tech is not going to do it by itself. We talked about AI and algorithms earlier, and yes, it does help a lot. It does help to, remove a lot of content that is straightforward, things that we all know or would consider to be bad. All right. But the stuff that's not, that you have to have a human actually look at and observe and read and whatever, becomes almost impossible to do. And I think when we have these discussions, people don't think about the scale of what we're talking about here. We're talking about millions of tweets per day by millions of people each and every day. I can tell you for a fact that there's just not enough manpower. Twitter can hire 1,000 more people just to sit there and moderate all day long, and it still wouldn't be enough for the amount of content. And that's including using AI, machine learning. It's, the bad guys figure out ways of circumventing that type of stuff. So I'm not saying it's impossible to do, because obviously it is. I mean, if you think about in the early 2000s when we all had to deal with spam, right? Now, obviously this is much more complex and it's much more dangerous than spam. But in the early 2000s, everyone's inbox was flooded with spam. Everyone's inbox had all these scams coming in on a daily basis, and we learned how to ignore them. We learned how to, discern obviously real emails from fake emails. And then technology kicked in and was able to filter a lot of that stuff out. And I do believe we're going to get to that point where humans are going to be able to look at a lot of this content that's being thrown at them and be able to say, okay, this is nonsense. This is disinformation. This is fake news. This is, just someone attacking this person that I don't believe this. But we're nowhere near that point yet. So I being a tech company and dealing with this on a daily basis and us looking at a lot of this stuff. Now, the one thing I will disagree on, and we actually do the opposite, and we teach the opposite, is the don't feed the troll thing. We don't agree with that at all. And here's the reason why. Yes, you are re-amplifying a lot of the stuff, but you can control the messaging that's going out. So if someone is saying, Christopher Bouzy did X, Y, and Z, I would a lot of times retweet that. You actually retweet that person, with actual factual information. Because when you leave the disinformation out there and you're not countering it with something else, that's allowing that person to not only control the narrative, but there's nothing out there for someone else who doesn't know who Christopher Bouzy is, doesn't know anything. They just see this one narrative and that's it, and they're not seeing that counter narrative. So, our approach is put a counter narrative out there, control the narrative, take the narrative away from the trolls. It disarms them in a lot of ways. Now, I do agree that there is the possibility of reamplification, that you're reamplifying what they're putting out there, and that's always a problem. But when you just have one narrative, it's not doing you any favors. The other thing that we come across at Bot Sentinel is the language barriers. Our algorithm, when I initially launched Bot Sentinel, one of the things that I was struggling with was the definition between bot versus troll. Now, I know what that is, but the average person out there don't. So it gets all lumped in together, bots, trolls, and everything else. It just became something where people were looking at it like, if an account does not agree with me, it's a bot, it's a troll, right? And that's just obviously not true. So one of the things that I had to do was try to figure out, okay, I can't design an algorithm or train a model based on my personal opinions, because my personal opinions or my views may be different for someone else. So I decided to use Twitter's actual terms of service, their rules and all of that as a guideline to train these models, to find accounts that were blatantly breaking Twitter's rules and build the model based on that, good accounts versus bad accounts. And that's great in terms of English language, right? But when you start looking at other languages, whether, Spanish, German, whatever, it becomes much harder, because you have to train a model based on all different languages, not just English. And something that's said in English may be offensive, which wouldn't be offensive in English, may be offensive in another language. And that's a whole nother hurdle as well. And once again, that's hurdles and that's problems that Twitter and other platforms are facing. And that's why I was saying, technology is great, but it's not the end all. It will not solve the problem by itself. It's going to take, different things. So when we do these things, right, and when we're trying to find, ways of being able to mitigate a lot of these attacks online, not just being able to point out and saying, hey, this is happening, but actually trying to make a difference, it's an uphill battle. So here's how I think it can be solved. I do believe legislation is going to play a huge part. I think we need to have legislation to guide platforms on how to govern better. I would love to, I know it's going to sound a little corny here, but I would love to see like a UN type of a thing for social media platforms where all the different nations are coming together and we have, a universal set of standards. So you don't have one country doing one thing, another country doing something else, and then now the platforms are trying to adjust themselves for each and every country. The other thing that I would like to see in terms of legislation, and it was pointed out earlier, targeting individuals do work. It does work. I should say it does work. But it becomes, if we're talking civil, then as stated before earlier, it's only people with the money that can do that. And I do think that it's actually effective. I do believe that more people should need to sue individuals, but how many people can do that? And in terms of criminal, let's be honest, criminal law doesn't always, it's not always equal. We all know that. Here in the United States, it's not always equal. Abroad, it's not always equal. So how does that look moving forward in terms of criminal law? And then with all the tens of thousands and millions of people that are doing this, and there are a lot of people who are doing this. Is there enough funding? You know, if we're just talking about the United States, and let's put aside, you know, every other country, here in the United States, let's just say 3 million, 4 million people a day are engaging in this type of hate, right? Just 3 or 4 million. Do we have the funds for investigators to go out and investigate this type of stuff? And I think the answer to that is no. And if we then expand that out to all the different countries, you know, how could we realistically do it? And these, you know, the people that are doing this understand this. They know the chances of them, you know, facing any legal consequences, whether it be civil or criminal, is pretty much zero. You know, they know this, and that's why they do it. And they feel emboldened doing it because they know the chances of them getting caught is slim to none. If the chances of them being exposed in terms of doxed or their information being put out there at the very least is slim to none. So they do this. And if their accounts get suspended or any platform, they know they can just create an account and continue the hatred and, you know, the targeted harassments and stuff like that. So I do think that we as a society have to figure out, you know, what are we looking at in terms of free speech? You know, find that you know, happy, I guess, compromise where we may have to give up something in return of, you know, being able to actually have positive discourse online. Because in my opinion, you know, we're not even close. You know, it's getting worse. When I launched Bot Sentinel in 2018, and I started working on it right after the 2016 election, you know, it was bad. It was bad. I think we all know that, but it's gotten increasingly worse since then. And, you know, with all the technology and all the efforts and all these organizations that are really, you know, coming into this space and trying to make a difference, you're just seeing these attacks get worse. You're seeing it, they become more, you know, bold and blatant. And, you know, I just believe that we as a society have to get a handle on this and have conversations like this, panels like these. And, you know, all of us coming together, whether it's, you know, the tech side of things, you know, judicial, law, whatever, and coming together and finding solutions. And I don't think we're going to have that silver bullet. And I guess that's the point I'm making with, you know, with everything I'm saying, that there is no silver bullet, that we have to use different tools and methods to accomplish this stuff. And whereas, you know, one tool might be great for, you know, one set of things or whatever, it may not be for others. You know, someone that's targeting, one individual that's targeting me, yeah, you know, going to law enforcement and if there's something on the books may work. But if there's a group of people, and that's what it is a lot of times, it's a group of people, 30, 40, 50 people spread out across, you know, the world, how do you combat that? So we need something.
Sorry. I was going to say, it's true that we in our first question, we asked you all to say what one thing would make the most difference. And all three of you have come back and said, not going to narrow it to one thing. That's not how this problem works.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So, sorry. Go ahead. I'm just wrap up now, Christopher, and then I want to give everyone a chance to respond to each other.
Yeah, I was going to do that. Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, it's not one thing. It's not one thing. It's going to take. It's going to take. Yeah. Multiple, you know, like I said, laws, technology, and platforms to hold themselves accountable. And right now, they have no incentive to do that. Platforms do not have an incentive to moderate themselves because at the end of the day, that engagement, the traffic, is how they make money. So yeah, it's going to take multiple things. I guess that's it for me. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So before we go on to our next questions, I just wanted to give you guys a chance, Chara and Imran, and also Christopher, in response to them. Is there anything that you wanted to pick up from each other's talks and respond to before we move on to other questions?
mean, I could just very quickly, I'll be very quick because I can see we're running out of time. I was going to say that I found Christopher's points really, really interesting because obviously he's the person on the ground. He can see how is this actually going to work in practice, and it's not going to be easy. I think I probably just want to reiterate what he said about there being no silver bullet, but also just to sort of, we need to take heart. We shouldn't just think, oh, it's going to be really difficult. There's nothing we can do. Oh, you know, genie's out of the bottle. Let's just leave it now. It's impossible. I think we should be positive and think there are things we can do. This is going to be, our kids are still going to be dealing with this in years to come. We're not going to solve this straight away, but that's the nature of any kind of social problem. Or, we have the criminal law, we've had the law of murder for centuries. People still murder, but that's not a reason not to have the offence of murder. So, we've got to start somewhere, and we're very, very, very much at the beginning of this. So take heart is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, I just to pick up on some of the points that Chris made, I mean, I think it's very unlikely that we'll get supranational legislation, but it's very likely that we'll get international alignment. We're actually hosting a conference in Washington, which is where I live, in May, with the Five Eyes countries plus EU, so US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the EU, to talk about what each of those countries has been doing in the last 2 years on legislation to do with online harms and hate. Because ironically, we've all, the last 2 years have really highlighted the need for some sort of statutory framework because of January the 6th and the pandemic and Russian disinformation around the Ukraine. Like, these are three exigent circumstances that have amplified the need for change. But we've not been able to see each other. So we're grabbing everyone into one room to talk about it with civil society as well, because that's really, really important that we are able to have those discussions and start to talk about what could be done on an international basis, and at the very least a de minimis framework for transparency of algorithms, of enforcement, of economics, and of how do you create an accountability and duty of care framework using different legal and cultural frameworks. So in the UK, we've gone the regulatory approach. In the US, it might be more about Section 230 reform. And there's some really interesting stuff on Section 230 reform that's happening right now. I gave evidence to that Congress, to the House Energy and Commerce Committee just before Christmas. There was 40 bills that I was being asked to comment on, all of which dealt with variations of Section 230, whether it's, removing the liability shield and algorithmic amplification, or it is particular harm. So there's tons of stuff going on around the world right now. But I'd make the point, if there's 3 or 4 million people online who are expressing hate every day, why are they not on the streets? And I think there's an answer there. It's norms, it's consequences. People don't think that anything will happen to them online. And that can't continue to be true. At the very least, platforms could take enforcement action. Now, we have a report coming out on Wednesday, and I mentioned this to Hannah and Laura earlier on, and I said, I'm really sorry that I can't talk about it in detail, but in short, we did a study in which we reported hundreds of bits of hatred sent by DM on Instagram to 5 prominent women to the platforms using their reporting functionality, and then we went back and checked how much action was taken against the people who sent 3 variations of harm. So either one-word misogynist abuse, what my team, who are all millennials, insist on calling dick pics, and I really hate using that word. I'm sorry if that offends anyone. And the third type being threats of violence to kill someone. And the action rate on that is incredibly low. And it wouldn't take a lot of effort to do what Instagram say they will do, which is to ban people that send those things. There's not thousands, there's not millions of them. There's hundreds. And yet no action's taken. And a small number of bad actors are able to toxify an entire environment. It's how antisocial behavior works in an offline setting as well. It's like one of the sort of central insights to ASB and how we handle it is that you've got to deal with, when you deal with bad actors, it sends a message to everyone else. A, to other bad actors that you won't get away with it, and B, to normal people, to the rest of society, that this is a safe space now because it's being looked after. And I think that's how norms can be shifted very rapidly, is real visible consequences and enforcement of the rule set.
Hey, Laura and I have some questions that we've prepared, but there's been really interesting questions coming in from the audience as well. And I would quite like to pick those up before the conversation moves too far away from where, from what they were responding to. So I'll start with Maya, who says, does shutting up unacceptable speech deal with the problems of racism and misogyny and so forth, or does it simply make it less visible but still festering beyond the surface? Does anyone want to respond to that?
I could say something about that. I suppose I'm sort of in the middle between Christopher and Imran on this in terms of feeding the troll or not feeding the troll. I think there's a time and a place, and I can definitely see feeding the troll too much in certain spaces is counterproductive, but equally there does need to be some discussion somewhere that sort of gives that counter narrative. So I think it is a kind of, time and place. I guess one thing that I'm interested generally in my work, and something I'd quite like to do more research on, and I'm sort of involved with, I'm a lawyer, but I'm involved with people who do kind of more social sciences research. I'm interested in the idea of bystanders and how people who are hearing, they may be the direct targets of the speech, but they're hearing the speech, what impact it has on them and how they feel about themselves, but also their place in a democratic society. So that's the that can be the issue, that how do we make sure that those people don't, they see these misogynistic comments or racist comments, whatever it is, but if there's no counter narrative, does that therefore then leave them feeling quite vulnerable and unsafe? So it's just trying to find that balance. I'm not really giving a straight answer here, but just saying that I can see both sides there.
Imran or Christopher, do either of you want to speak to this question of potentially just forcing things further underground or out of sight?
Sure.
So I think this is a really, sorry, Chris, this is a really important and valuable concept. The idea of well, I think there's confronting hate when you see it. There is inoculating against hate and trying to remove the conditions in which hate can be freely expressed, but also whether or not it's possible to make hate invisible, and if that makes it worse when it festers. And I mean, my argument would be that we're never going to if your aim is to stop people from hating, that's the wrong aim to have. It's to stop hate from affecting our society. I when I'm trying to tell the team about the goals that we have as an organization, I remind them that our great grandparents were dealing with hate, and our great grandchildren are going to be dealing with hate. And our privilege is to be, in our generation, the people who try to push the arc of history towards justice, and towards greater tolerance and decency and a more enlightened society. And so if you are humble about your goals and say that your job is to try and reduce the impact of hate on our society, whether it is to toxify and make more vociferous and brittle our discourse and our identity as peoples for purposes of democracy and purposes of having advanced societies, or it is simply to reduce the pain that it causes of being called bad names. And it's designed to be painful. It's intentionally painful, or it's designed to make you resile from using those spaces. And so to encourage us to use those spaces, there are benefits in reducing the prevalence and visibility of hatred that are valuable. And I think that is still a debate as to whether or not that is true. There are people that say that, well, no, we should see the hate wherever it appears. I don't agree with that. I don't think we need to necessarily hear every sort of fart that comes out of someone's head. I don't. And I think that often that can be quite damaging. And, you know, it negates the very value of having society, civilization, and moral values and virtues in our conduct in society. But then the question of feeding the trolls, I mean, I maintain the mathematical benefits of reducing the algorithmic amplification given to hateful narratives and its ability to insert itself as being the central dividing lines in our society. However, I see that many people want to defend themselves against hatred when they see it. It's not working, is it?
Mm. Christopher, what were you going to say there? I mean, a huge part of what Bot Sentinel does is making it so that these accounts can't hide.
Right. So just to answer his question, it does work. It actually does. If it's done correctly. I mean, we just recently did a series of reports on the whole Meghan Markle situation where hate accounts were targeting her. And one of the things that we did was amplify those accounts. Because in the beginning of this, most people were like, well, why should I care about someone who's essentially a celebrity, who is essentially rich? And yeah, you're going to attract that type of attention in terms of that negativity, the harassment, the hate. So why should I care? So one of the things we did was first educate not just my followers or the Bot Sentinel community, but other people that, look, she's a human being, obviously, but this is not about a quote unquote rich person just being attacked. And, it's about it's targeted harassment. It's a group of people that are doing this. And the opinions of people changed over time, where in the beginning, it was more like, why should I care, to like, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe this is happening. And the narrative about her also changed. And also we have data that shows the negativity that was, on Twitter, at least, that was, it was something like her score was in the low 30s or something like that in terms of sentiment, where just people just viewed her negatively. And sometime last week when we ran it again, we've been running the analysis every few weeks, she was in the high 80s. So we have data proving that going at this head on and changing that narrative does work. Now, going back to the original question in terms, I do believe that we need to make social media platforms hostile towards people who are doing this. Where if they're saying things that are racist, that are hateful, misogynistic, whatever, that they're going to face pushback from the community. And I think when you try to just ignore it and just let it just fester, they know that they can just say what they want to say, and other people that are starting to follow them may say, hey, if this person could do it, I could do it, and let me go ahead and start saying whatever it is that I want to say. And I do think that on social media, at least, we have this thing where we just allow people to just say what they want to say, because we're just like, okay, it's so many people that are just doing it. Don't feed the trolls, right? Why should I, I'm not going to waste my time with this. I'm just going to just ignore it and just do whatever. And I just feel that's just the wrong approach, that we do need to make social media platforms hostile towards folks that are doing this.
Okay, so Alice asks, all of you have touched on the need to adjust norms for users. How do we go about that piece of education? Is there a toolkit or something? What would be? How do you undertake a cultural shift like that?
Well, it's expensive, I can tell you that, because we're currently putting together a curriculum and working out how to use a cascaded stakeholder strategy to get it out to millions of people over the next few years. But to start to educate people as to the mathematics of digital platforms and how they work, the rules of physics of those platforms. Forgive me, I started in the hard sciences, so to always use terms like physics, and I know it's not really the rules of physics, but it's really difficult. I mean, the irony. So CCDH kind of like one of the reasons we set up was we used to have these conversations with people, and everyone go, you know what? Like, we'd see a lot less of this stuff. People didn't bloody retweet it all the time, and we're sort of like at the pub conversation come to life, and it's an actual. So when people at the pub are going, if we could just tell people not to do these things, it would actually make things a lot better. If we could just help people understand what the impact is, it would be. And so CCDH kind of does that. And I mean, that the user behavioral stuff is really, really important, and it will take a lot of effort for us to understand it. And you've got to think of it a little bit like the campaign to persuade people to wear seatbelts, and to it takes these things. And we have literally taken succor and direct advice from people that have run campaigns on things like seatbelts and washing your hands and everything else from to understand how to induce that sort of behavioral change. But it will require a broader understanding of how these platforms work. I think the Haugen stuff was really valuable in that, though, in that there is no longer any debate now on the core mathematics of those platforms and the way in which amplification works on those platforms. And just to sort of make one point as well, to sort of reinforce, and I really dislike being that I've put myself as sort of the anti-Chris, because I'm not the anti-Chris. I very much agree with Chris in many respects, but the direct responses on a platform that literally amplifies based on engagement is mathematic amplification. But CCDH has highlighted bad actors. Like the Disinformation Dozen is our most famous piece of work about anti-vaxxers. There's a lot of active calculation that goes into it, in that if you can force platform action on hate actors and bad actors, then amplification for the purposes of, turning that light into a laser beam that eradicates a problem is very, very, and makes it unacceptable, is very, very helpful. So it's about strategic countering rather than just combating online. It's why we're not the Centre for Combating Digital Hate, the Centre for Countering it. There was always a sense that takes some strategy.
Yeah. One challenge that occurs to me as you give the example of seatbelts or any of the other kind of important behavioural change programs that have been, is that in this context, not wearing a seatbelt isn't profitable. Digital hate can be extremely profitable, can't it?
Well, not wearing a seatbelt was, because and there are other safety features which seatbelts are maybe not the best example, but there are safety features which are costly, and creating those costs for companies. So at the moment, for a company to moderate a piece of speech, it reduces their revenues because they've got less content and therefore less advertising, and it increases their costs. And there's legal liability under Section 230. So they've got zero liability under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act 1996 for third-party content on their website. They don't give a crap. Like their fiduciary duty, their fiduciary incentive is to literally do nothing. And if they are fulfilling their fiduciary duties to their shareholders, which is the only duty that they have, their job is to sit on their hands and to stop the moment, to delay as long as possible any action being taken. Because delaying any action being taken, this is how much it's worth to Facebook, $320 million a year. That was their revenues last year. Every day they can stop action being taken, they can keep growing that $320 million a day that they make.
No, so I mean that's the profitability to focus on, for sure, but it's also profitable to an individual, isn't it? People can live off the YouTube advertising for their hate account. I know this from some of Christopher's reports. I'm going to move on to Andrea's comment. Sorry, Christopher, did you want to speak to that?
I just wanted to say, that's just a small part of it, that there are firms that are out there now that are profiting off of this stuff, that you can go and hire overseas firms that would push out disinformation for you or attack an opponent in terms of a political campaign. So yeah, hatred and targeted harassment is big business now.
It's an industry. It's a growth industry. Okay, Andrea asked about moderators not picking up on keywords. She's seen this a lot with incel cultures, where on the surface, what has been said isn't hateful, but it's written in coded language that speaks to a specific audience for a specific goal, which is explicitly hateful. Anyone speak to that?
Just really quickly, and that's the point, one of the points that I was making earlier, that's where things become really difficult, because a lot of the moderation happens overseas. Facebook, Twitter, pretty much all of the social media platforms outsource the bulk of their moderation. I mean, obviously they do some in-house, but the bulk of it is overseas. So it's absolutely correct that the coded language goes over their head a lot of times. But to go back to the previous point, they're trying to look, there is really no incentive for them to stop this, right? And we've already discussed this. There's really no incentive for them to really try to stop stuff that's generating revenue for them. So they take the most egregious stuff off. Like I said, the stuff that we all can agree on. But the stuff that's written in a way that goes over most people's head, it doesn't get removed, and that's a serious problem as well.
Thanks. Okay, next question is Finn. So I'm conscious we've got 7 minutes left and 5 questions, so this is quick fire now. Referring back to the upcoming online safety bill, do we know if specific crimes such as cyber flashing and AI nudification will be part of the bill?
So cyber flashing is. AI nudification, do you mean deep fakes by that?
That's what I would assume, yeah.
Yes, yeah. I don't think there's anything in there. I could be wrong on this, so don't quote me. I don't think there's anything in there at the moment. That's going to be my next project. Maybe ask me in about 6 months. I think deepfakes is a real problem for the criminal law. It's a big, big problem trying to work out what the harm is, what exactly is the harm if it's AI, and it sort of turns on its head our usual justifications for removing nudity online. So it's a really interesting one from a sort of criminal theory point of view. But yeah, cyber flashing is in there.
Do Christopher or Imran want to speak to deepfakes? Okay.
Oh yeah, I can just say something really quickly. I thought he was going to take it. Huge problem. We're actually working on tech now to help users, be able to identify, deepfake images, videos and things of that nature. It's going to be a huge problem. It's a huge problem now. It's going to just get worse.
Okay, Ruth Lewis asks, I think this is specifically to Imran. What did you mean by the Haugen stuff?
I responded in the chat, but
it's great.
The materials divulged by Francis Haugen, the whistleblower, who came forward from Facebook with a treasure trove of internal documentation showing that they had systematically covered up their awareness of how they'd failed to moderate hate on their platform. If you remember, they even of the hate they detected, they only took action against 3 to 5%, they realized, and 0.6% of violent threats. So the fact is that, and one of the funny things is that showed that they had the denominator in the equation. One of the things they'd often say is, we take action against thousands of bits of information, bad of hate a day, but we'd always say, but what's the denominator? It turns out they had the denominator all along, because they were able to calculate that it was about 4 to 5%, 3 to 5%, and 0.6% of violent threats. So she really, and she also, she exposed a ton of shocking stuff where, as an example, one of our reports, Disinformation Dozen, which said that 12 people created over 65% of the misinformation about vaccines. They came out initially and said, it came out on March the 24th, 2021. They came out initially and said it's all rubbish and that's just nonsense. It's barely believable. And Haugen revealed that on the very same day that our report came out, an internal report of Facebook said that a tiny number of people produced the vast amount of the disinformation. So, that this is a company that gaslights at industrial scale, a global scale. It was very helpful.
Thanks. Okay, so in response to my points about the seatbelt, someone who probably wasn't Laura Clancy, but you're all Laura Clancy, made the good point that car safety is about so much more than just seatbelts. It is also a problem that needs to be approached from multiple angles, including speed and alcohol, drugs, and mobile use, and so forth. And the threat keeps changing, and the response needs to keep up. Okay, there's your response to Ruth, which you've also shared with us, and that takes us to the end, because it looked to me like there were 6 questions, but it's fine because here we are with 3 minutes to go, and we've got through all the audience questions. I'm very glad. I really did want to get through all the audience questions. Laura and I had lots more questions that we wanted to ask from ourselves, but I don't think that there's time for that. So do the 3 of you want to wrap up with any final points before we say goodbye?
Well, can I just put a plug in for the website? And if anyone wants to see the research which comes out on Wednesday, then if they go to counterhate.com, then they can sign up for updates there, or follow us on Twitter, CCD Hate, or Instagram, Counterhate. I'm sorry that we couldn't talk about it in more detail today. Thanks.
Well, let's keep talking. This is an ongoing project. We've got maybe 5 more events this year in total, and our next one is next month. So please, everybody, come to that. Please also, very grateful if you can fill in our feedback form, even if it's in the most cursory fashion. It's still helpful, demonstrates that that this happened, and maybe even was of value, even better. And it just remains, I think, to say huge thanks. Thank you to the Sociological Review for funding these events, our first 3 events. Thank you to Chara, Imran, and Christopher for sharing your expertise and your specific knowledge from your different fields. That all is just so valuable to bring you all together. And thanks everybody for coming. Is there anyone else I should thank, Laura?
No, lovely. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Really enjoyed it.
Really enjoyed all your answers. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.